Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Greetings. Thank you for joining. Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. If I can ask to make sure that you are muted and we'll get started. I have to probably wrap up a little bit earlier than I usually do. So thank you for joining me, and we're gonna get kicking off right now. So welcome to yet another one of our Dish with Dina wellness webinars. These monthly webinars are always free. We have a variety of topics, and this month we are focusing on gut health. So a few housekeeping things. As always, you know that the session is recorded because if you registered and we're not able to attend the live event, which sometimes happens, you are able to receive the recording of this session afterwards. Sometimes I say within a day or two, usually it's like a week. So forgive me for sometimes taking a little bit of time to edit this and get it up and running. You can use the chat box at any time, but there will be some time left at the end of the presentation to do a formal Q&A. Obviously, please make sure that you recognize I am not your dietitian, even though I am a dietitian, and you do reach out to your own healthcare providers before you begin any sort of treatment plan or start doing things, whether it's food, nutrition, medication modifications. Make sure that you're speaking with your doctor first. Just a side note on a couple of things. Number one, these sessions, like I said, are recorded. They're also a few months after the fact, they're also uploaded to my YouTube channel. So while I always encourage everybody to feel free to interact and engage as much as possible, if you do not want to have your image on the public space, then obviously keep your camera turned off. If you feel like renaming your name on the Zoom uh, little image there, you can click those little three dots and put your initials in instead if you want to. And then you are automatically, when you registered for these webinars, you're automatically added to our Dish with Dina mailing list. So if you're not already receiving the newsletter, as I assume a lot of you probably are, since it's where I do promote these webinars and other services and other events that we put together, you will be receiving those in the future. So you can always opt out at any time. And we also use that mailing list as a way to obviously send you the recording link and send out surveys to make sure that we are doing what we can and it's being received well. And we also ask for feedback as far as other topics that might be of interest to you so that we know what to create in the future. So let us get started. To introduce myself, if you are not already aware, my name is Dina D'Alessandro. I am a registered dietitian, nutritionist based mostly out of New York City and sometimes in New Jersey, and very much on the virtual space. I'm also an adjunct lecturer of undergraduate and graduate nutrition studies at Lehman College here in the Bronx. And I'm also the campus dietitian there as well at Lehman College in the Student Health Center. I created Dish with Dina as a virtual platform and also as a private practice when I first became a dietitian about 8 years ago. And since then, I've done quite a lot of things, as you can see on screen here. I have been trained twice, actually, by the CDC with their Prevent Type 2 Diabetes workshop program. And I also was very fortunate to be involved in some research studies. I've also been featured in some pretty well-known websites and national periodicals, newspapers, magazines, which is always kind of cool. It makes me feel like I am an expert now after having set out to do this as a second career. It's kind of neat that people are coming to me and, like you are, relying on me to share education and information in the nutrition space. I'm also presenting and being involved in panel discussions and clinical conferences and seminars, etc., which is always really great. And I always love, love, love working with students and interns and also newly credentialed dietitians to help mentor them or coach them in their academic and career pursuits. So thank you again for those of you who are joining. And let's get started. So when we talk about the gut, let's just define what that is. The gut is the word that we use to define the gastrointestinal system. And I like to call this the 30-ish foot long twisting tube, hollow tube that goes, quote, from mouth to south. It also plays a role in a lot of different functions, which of course I will share with you shortly. And most importantly, we'll talk about this at the end, sort of at the end of the presentation, is what's known as your microbiome. These are known as your good bacteria, your hopefully friendly bacteria, or what we call the good bugs in our gut, which help us with our digestion, our immunity, and supporting our overall health, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So here we have the gut functions. If you've never seen what your gut looks like, I'm not putting a true anatomy photo on here, but it's quite literally from mouth to south, as I like to say. We'll talk a little bit too about the brain function and relationship to our gut as well, but we're talking about the oral cavity, your mouth, your esophagus, how you swallow, and what's known as ingestion. So that's basically just getting food and beverages and medicine into your body. So the act of putting food, beverages, and medicine into your body is the act of ingestion, and that comes in through the mouth and through the esophagus. We also have a couple of roles that our body mechanisms play. We have a physical or a mechanical function of chewing, right? The act of chewing and kind of breaking down those food products and getting them into smaller units in our body. And then we also have the role that our stomach plays of once the food is broken down and it goes into like a ball of mushed up product. Our body plays a role also of kind of what I call like the washing machine. It swishes things around and gets things into its form to start being sent out to where it needs to go to be utilized as energy. So that's the whole point of, calories and food, specifically what we're talking about, food and beverages, right? The units of calories that are in them, how much we are eating, is like putting gas in the tank of our car, and the tank being our body. So here we have the mechanical breaking down of what our body does. We also have a chemical digestion function, which it involves things like hormones and enzymes, and a lot of different ways that our body recognizes how to take those, what are known as the macronutrients, right? So we have the carbohydrates, the fats, and the proteins. Those are known as macronutrients. So that's a large form molecule. But our body needs to break that down in some way. So not only does it do it by chewing and swallowing and swashing it around in the stomach, but it also does it by chemical digestion. So the breaking apart in these chemical reactions of getting those large molecules into smaller units. And that all is done by the things that you can see there. So the salivary glands contain enzymes, which break down we have salivary amylase, which breaks down the carbohydrates. We have lingual lipase, which breaks down fats. We also have enzymes in our stomach to break down our proteins. We also have our gallbladder and our liver that is helping create with the bile ducts that are in there. Our gallbladder shoots out the bile, and that breaks down fats as well. Our pancreas contains insulin that helps with lowering our blood sugar and getting our energy, our calorie, those nutrients to where they need to go. And then when they get down to the small intestine is also opening up its cells and what's known as the microvilli, and it is grabbing all of those really good nutrients and getting them to where they need to go in our body to continue the function, which is known as either metabolism or absorption. So by the time it gets to the lower part of our gut, it has done the process of breaking down, and it's now going off. It's kind of marching into place as to where it needs to go. This thing goes off to our muscles. This thing will go off to our heart. This thing goes off to some other place that we need to create whatever function it is doing. So we have that take place in the large intestine and the small intestine in the lower section of our gut. And whatever is left over, whatever we cannot digest or utilize, or is a byproduct of those chemical reactions that are taking place in our body, goes out through our system. This is feces, not urine. Urine takes place in our bladder and kidneys, and that's a whole different functioning system in our body, but this goes through our lower intestine area, rectum and anus. So I mentioned earlier that our brain plays a role as well. We'll talk about how that's related. We sometimes will say things like, I'm going with my gut, or have a gut feeling about something. And we call our gut, specifically the lower part of our gut, our second brain. So I'll share with you why that is. There is something known as the gut-brain axis. And what happens here is that we have something called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve creates a bidirectional or a two-way communication through our brain and our gut. It tells us to be hungry. It tells us to be full. It gives us the fight or flight reaction too. We have what's known as your central nervous system and your enteric nervous system. So these are the connections that are made for this bidirectional communication. So the connection through our emotions, our thoughts, and our hunger cues all are playing a role here. So this is why we'll sometimes see, and coming up soon, we'll also see this too, that if you are dealing with a gut disorder, if you have a diagnosis of something going on in your gut, an illness, a condition, whatever, it could potentially affect, because again, it's two-way communications, bidirectional. It could potentially affect how we're thinking, our thoughts, brain fog, inability to focus. It could affect some of our thought processes or our cognitive functions. And in the opposite direction, I should say, our brain, if we're struggling with, a lot of stress or we haven't slept really well and we're feeling super foggy, it could potentially affect our ability to regulate our hunger or be able to metabolize and digest certain things. So playing, a role across the board, we always say, yes, we have multiple systems within our body, but it really is true that so much is related to so many other things. Everything is connected to everything else in our body. All right, so when you think of gut disorders, you can put it in the chat if you want to. What comes to mind? What are some common gut disorders that you've heard of before? And again, remember, from mouth to south, so it doesn't have to just be at the bottom region. It could also be in the top region of your gut. If you want to share whatever comes to mind, feel free to do so. I'm going to take a sip of water, and then I'm going to share on screen, not everything, because there's quite a lot, but some of the more common ones. All right, so on screen here, quite a lot of stuff, right? We have acid reflux, also known as gastroesophageal reflux disorder or GERD. Yeah, Brittany, exactly, right? Irritable bowel syndrome is listed on here, IBS. I'm actually going to pull that out as a focus topic to discuss today as well. So as you're going through the list here, the things that are in italics are bacterial infections or bacterial disorders. C. difficile is unfortunately usually contracted in a hospital setting when people are going for bowel surgery, or if they have an intestinal issue that they're being operated on, they can contract. It's a hospital infection, and it's very fatal. So that's an issue there too that could be very serious. Celiac disease, technically an autoimmune disease. This is something that you may or may not be born with. It's our inability to break down the gluten protein that's found in things like barley and wheat and some other items, and it's in makeup and candy. So that is something too that is located in the lower part of our gut, in the small intestine. Cholecystitis, I teach my students about looking at root words when it comes to trying to figure out what some of these mean. So the cholecystectomy, or CHOLE, has to do with your gallbladder. And whenever you see, I'm going to actually put this in the chat, whenever you see the suffix itis, that is indicative of an inflammation of something. So a flare up has happened and it's causing distress. Depending on, the range, the spectrum of what the disorder is, it could be quite uncomfortable, or it could be in need of surgery or some sort of repair or therapy in there. So cholecystitis is basically just an inflammation of your gallbladder. Going down through here, cystic fibrosis, I thought that was interesting because cystic fibrosis is a lung disorder. It's a respiratory condition, usually diagnosed at a very early age. It has a very short lifespan, or I should say, unfortunately, it's a very short life expectancy for people with cystic fibrosis. And the issue here that is, again, related to the GI system is that it impairs the ability for our bodies to remove mucus, right? So that's what we do. We expectorate and we defecate, and there's a lot of stuff that's coming out of our bodies when we are excreting. And in the case of cystic fibrosis, that builds up and it ends up causing the inability to breathe properly or some respiratory conditions. So again, you have some other items that are listed here that may or may not seem familiar. H. pylori, or Helicobacter pylori, is the bacteria that is responsible for ulcers. As Brittany mentioned in the chat, irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, that is more common than we would want it to be. That's sometimes a ruling out of things. So we're going to talk a little bit more about IBS coming up shortly. We have pyloric stenosis. That's something that very, very tiny babies suffer from, where there is an issue that they can't digest certain things. And also down below, ulcerative colitis. That is part of what's known as inflammatory bowel disease. So we have Crohn's disease, which is listed over there in the C section. And then we have ulcerative colitis. So Crohn's disease is the issue or the condition that affects the upper part of the GI tract, and ulcerative colitis, colon, itis, inflammation, is what happens towards the bottom. And these are very, very challenging things. We're going to see in a second what happens when we have a diagnosis of these common disorders and what to do about them. It could be quite tricky. It could take a lot of time to go through stuff to see what works or what doesn't work. And unfortunately, because, it has to do with digestive system, it can be quite uncomfortable when people are dealing with these disorders, that it may even flare up or trigger some disordered eating patterns because people are worried, if I eat this, I'll feel like that. Or I was told not to eat certain things and now I'm afraid to eat anything. And so their list of foods that they enjoy or that they used to have as part of their everyday eating plan might get smaller and smaller. So of course, this is where I'm going to step in and say, make sure you're working not only with your doctor, but make sure you're also working with a dietitian, especially somebody who might specialize in GI dietetics or nutrition therapy. So we can really get to the bottom of what's going on and help you lead a healthy, happy life. So on the right-hand side here, again, just a kind of an example of some of the potential conditions or issues that might happen in the gut, where then you would be having to adhere to a special diet or some modifications. So at the top, constipation, we might all get that once in a while, or it could be a little bit more chronic where it happens more frequently. In that case, a dietitian might recommend that you increase the fiber in your food choices, like beans and vegetables, etc. But you also increase fluid intake because you don't want to make the condition worse. Whenever we increase fiber, we always make sure we include fluid intake, increasing that as well to make sure things are kind of flowing regularly and getting your body going. Jumping down to some of the more complicated things like esophageal cancer or bariatric surgery or esophageal surgery, or if somebody has an ostomy bag of some sort. In dietetics, we always say, if the gut works, use it, meaning that we don't necessarily want to start, tube feeding somebody or having to feed somebody intravenously. So what we'll do is we'll take the shortest form of action and work our way down. So in the case of somebody who might be recovering from something that might have to go back into a very small, frequent meals and maybe very low in calorie, and the inability to chew and swallow, if that's an issue too, we might end up doing modified texture. So we puree things or kind of make them very, very small. So it's much easier mechanically for our body to digest that. In an issue like gallbladder issues or like a cholecystectomy, like I mentioned before, if we're getting rid of the gallbladder and we're unable to, or pancreatitis, where the pancreas is not able to help in assisting certain things, we might end up restricting some of those macronutrients. So we might say, lay off of the fat, even things like good fats like avocados and nuts, we might say lay off of those or decrease those or limit them, because your body right now is either unable to process that or it's in the middle of a repair. And once you are back up and running or things have corrected in whatever way that is for you, then you can reintroduce those nutrients back in. Jumping down to the bottom here, second bullet about slow, frequent meals, like I mentioned, a lot of times that's really the issue. If somebody's having, even just an upset stomach, but if somebody's dealing with one of those complicated, gut disorders, it might make more sense for them not to follow the typical 3 meals a day kind of rule or recommendation. It might make more sense for them to eat 6 smaller broken up meals, or every couple of hours have something. So it doesn't necessarily mean they have to create brand new meals from scratch every time. They could just break it down, like, part 1, part 2 of breakfast, part 1, part 2 of lunch, part 1, part 2 of dinner. So it's spread out a lot more and it's easier for them to swallow, digest, metabolize, etc. We usually also recommend avoiding things that could potentially trigger some flare-ups or cause some discomfort, like avoiding things that are acidic, spicy, caffeine as well. And that very bottom thing there, which I'm going to explain in a second, is known as following a low FODMAP diet. And I'm going to purposely talk about this because it has been my experience with working with people with gut disorders, specifically people who have been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. When they do not meet with a dietitian, they get very bad direction from their doctors. And I keep saying, no offense to doctors, but yeah, kind of offense to doctors sometimes. Like, just reach out and put somebody in touch with a dietitian, because what ends up happening here is that it's a complication, not a terribly severe one, but sometimes to the person it can feel severe. And when they are told or handed off a list of something that they are told to avoid completely, that's doing them a huge disservice. And that's not exactly how we present the low FODMAP diet approach. It's supposed to be a very small, limited, time sensitive type of thing where we introduce and eliminate certain things over a period of time. And that's the whole point of working with a dietitian, to make sure you understand what that means. So let's start with defining what even is a FODMAP. Well, FODMAP is just an acronym or a fancy way of saying carbohydrates, but specifically carbohydrates that ferment in our gut. Not every carbohydrate, or I should say, most carbs probably have the ability to do this, but we're talking about things that are on higher level of fermenting. So these fancy words you see in front of you are just ways of saying sugar. So we have oligosaccharides. Again, that prefix just means multiple or many, so a long chain form of sugar, a disaccharide, a monosaccharide, and things that are known as polyols, or what are known as sugar alcohols. So a lot of times if you eat something like a sugar-free something, like if somebody's managing diabetes and they're going off and eating a lot of sugar-free things that might contain, artificial sweeteners or low sugar items, that can cause some gut disruption. So these are just basically carbohydrates or sugars that the small intestines cannot properly absorb, and people end up feeling a variety of uncomfortable things, bloating, I want to say maybe some cramping sometimes too, especially if you're dealing with a true diagnosis of IBS. And so, thanks to the Monash University, all the way across the world in Australia, they have been doing tons of research, and they're a really great resource if you are following the FODMAP diet or the low FODMAP diet. So here's just an example of some things that appear on the high end and the low end. And again, for people who are diagnosed with IBS, it doesn't mean that you're taking everything out on the left-hand side and you're putting everything in on the right-hand side. What it means is that we're starting to look at patterns of things. We might ask you to keep a journal or a food log, that when you eat something, you just write down if you know the ingredients, or if you're going out to eat, you ask questions like, what is in this particular dish that I'm eating? And as you can see at the very top, high FODMAP list underneath the vegetable section, I mean, onions and garlic are the first two things that sometimes have to go, or at least have to be eliminated for a short period of time, to see if that alleviates any of the irritable bowel symptoms. And we cook a lot of stuff with onions and garlic, my friends. So this could be, very sad to have to let go of. But again, what we usually do is every 3 weeks or so, we kind of like rotate a variety of, we pick and choose a couple of different items on the high list and we get rid of them. And we introduce the ones on the low list to potentially substitute, or like teach people how they could substitute whatever they might be missing. And then we ask the patients to document as they go. And 3 weeks later, we say, did it or did it not work? Are your symptoms alleviated? Okay, then we go back to the next thing. We go and reintroduce the high FODMAP items back in one at a time. So this is where it can be really challenging too, to be having a condition like that and having to manage it like that. Like you could be spending an entire year figuring out a list of foods that do or do not work for you. Brittany asked, should patients with IBS avoid anything acidic? So Brittany, it could depend. Like not everybody has the same reaction to everything. So that could be one of those things that we could say, here's a list of potentially acidic foods, or like a hot sauce would be one of the things I might say, maybe alleviate that. If you're the person who always puts hot sauce on every single thing, maybe that's one thing we should try to get rid of immediately, because it could be spicy and somewhat acidic. Or take away maybe any lemon or vinegars from your diet for the next couple of weeks and see if that alleviates your symptoms. Because again, not everybody might have the same issues. And not just Brittany, but anyone else who's listening to this, it's multifactorial. So this is why sometimes it can be kind of time consuming. It can feel kind of challenging to manage a condition like this, because you might have to make notes of everything. It's possible that you're thinking something with acid is causing my gut to flare up, or I'm having these, symptoms happen when with my gut. But then you realize, no, it has to do because you didn't sleep well enough, or you're going through lots of stress, and stress affects, right? We said this before, stress affects your digestive issues, that two brain discussion there. So it could have maybe nothing to do with food and everything to do with what's on your brain, what's going on in your brain. So again, this is why it's a little bit more of like an experimental trial and error, and it could be quite time consuming. A lot of patients on here who might be, really suffering the consequences of it are at maybe their wits' end and are willing to commit to something like a year long of introducing and eliminating things. And some people are like, you know what, my symptoms aren't that bad. I'm going to deal with it. It's not a big deal. I do not want to get rid of anything spicy, or I don't want to get rid of my coffee, and I don't want to get rid of my onions and garlic. So again, it's going through the process of like trial and elimination and reintroduction. So I'm just sharing this as an FYI, but this could be something that if you or anyone you know is dealing with IBS, obviously, number one, talk to your doctor. Number two, get referred to a dietitian. Number three, check out the Monash University resources. I believe they even have an app. So don't try to self-diagnose anything just in case, because this may not alleviate some of your symptoms. If you don't truly have IBS, you might have some other issue at hand. So, get an endoscopy, colonoscopy, and those sort of things. All right, let's talk a little bit too about what is known as repairing the gut. So we talked just in that slide, those couple of slides before, of potential medical nutrition therapy, food modifications that can help with managing the condition. And now what if your gut is all messed up and you need to kind of repair it and fix it? So this is where these next couple of slides are going to go into. We'll talk a little bit about supplements in a sec. I'm going to talk about that in one of the upcoming slides, but it's possible that you might be given supplements. And I, as a dietitian, am not super savvy with supplements. So that would be something that your doctor could prescribe, or another dietitian who's a little bit more specialized in gut diseases could prescribe for you to understand. But the issue with supplements, as I always like to say, is that it's based on a deficiency of something. So if you go back before what I was saying with things like bariatric surgery, or specifically in the lower gut where things are being absorbed, if you remember that picture with where absorption is taking place, it's down below, right? So if you have a surgery or an inflammation, and there might be an issue there with your body is not absorbing or not able to take in the nutrients that are supposed to be part of that normal process of eating and digesting things and absorbing things, it might end up being like, oh, I'm deficient in calcium, or I'm deficient in iron, or something that along the line of my gut has not been able to get into my system. And so your doctor might prescribe supplementation. So we try to work with food, try to give you whatever rich foods there are to provide you with that particular nutrient of concern. But if your body is just clear on being like, I can't do this, then you might have to go into a little bit more of an extreme form of supplementation or IV or whatever. There could also be an issue with medication. So medications that people are taking, especially long term, could block the absorption of nutrients. And so again, you might be given supplements for that to kind of like kick in or like add extra of what you need from what the side effects are of your medications. We'll talk a little bit about pre and probiotics in the coming slides. So I'm going to hang on to that for a second. And then fiber, this is all kind of related, right? We talked before about some of the food choices we make in fibrous foods. If you've attended some of my webinars before, we definitely have gone over fibrous foods, but sometimes people think of fiber as like leafy greens, salads, and so on. And definitely there are fibers in any kind of plant, but there are much more fibrous, or I should say there's a much higher fiber quality or value in things like beans and legumes, chickpeas, etc. But those are also the things that sometimes make us feel super gassy. And that's really the whole point of what fiber does, which I'll explain in a second, that it helps feed the gut bacteria, it helps feed that. So in that chemical process of that feeding, we're going to have some fermentation. It's going to be bubbly a little bit. So as a nation, we don't really get as much fiber as we should. We try to recommend about 25 to 35 grams a day. So if you're eating food products over the course of the day that have labels on them, check to see if it's got a decent amount of fiber per serving. And honestly, at this point, a decent amount would be anything between, say, 3 to 5 grams of fiber per serving. So like a piece of toast, I think is about 3 grams or so, depending on if it's whole wheat or not. So you can always check the labels for that, and hopefully it adds up over the course of the day. But if you want to really get more bang for your buck, throw in a, half a cup of beans in a salad, or spread something like that out over the course of the day so that fiber adds up. But as I said before, if you're increasing fiber, make sure that you're getting enough fluid. Otherwise, constipation will happen. You will not be happy about that. All right, so prebiotics. Prebiotics are basically the foods that feed our good bacteria. It encourages the growth of the bacteria that's already in our gut, the good stuff that's happening down there, the things that help us with our immunity and all those functions that we talked about before. And prebiotics come from a variety of plant foods. You can see the whole list down here, right? And if you want to make sure that you're also taking into account the fiber quotient or quantity to things. Again, you can look things up on the internet because fruits and vegetables don't usually have a nutrition label on them. So you can check out, Google something, or you can download an app to get an understanding of what kind of fiber quantity is in a particular food item. But the going rule is usually the deeper the color, the higher the fiber content. So the richer, deeper, darker colors do tend to have more fiber in them, as you can see there. And also sometimes, when things are stripped away, so like whole grains are going to have the bran on them. That's a whole grain. That's why it's called that. So we have things like brown rice or whole grains like oatmeal or even corn. Technically, corn is a whole grain because it has the skin on it. Any kind of fruit or vegetable that you can eat with the skin on it, so like a potato that you don't peel or an apple that you don't peel, these would give a higher fiber quantity to you as well and help with that prebiotic food that is helping feed our good bugs in our gut. Probiotics are basically the living organisms. So they are the bacteria on the outside of our world, right? We have the bacteria on the inside of our world in our guts, and then we also have the ones that are outside. So I'll explain a little bit about where to find those. But maybe some of the names that you see here on the side, like lactobacillus, maybe those are familiar to you. But these are live microorganisms. And what they do, so we said before the right? Pre as in coming before something. So you're feeding and helping the growth of the bacteria in your gut. The probiotics are building on top of that. So think of it as if I take an antibiotic, I'm killing off bacteria that could potentially be, giving me an infection, or that are not good bacteria, they're bad bacteria. So the antibiotics will kill the bacteria, where the probiotics help build that back up. They add more. They're kind of like dumping extra food into my gut, or dumping extra bacteria into my gut, I should say. So they help with improving or maintaining that microbiome, that natural balance. They could also be in supplement form. A lot of people take, pills or liquid versions of probiotics, but my friends, it's tricky. Sometimes you spend a lot of money and you're not really getting quality stuff, or there's no way of knowing what else might be in something. You also don't know what you need. You might be out of, bifidobacterium. You don't know that. So whatever probiotic you might be buying off the shelf, or even better, in a refrigerator in a drugstore, because these are, not necessarily shelf stable. They are living organisms, so they should be in a temperature control, but they're very sensitive to heat and moisture. So you could be doing your body a disservice and your wallet a disservice, that you're spending money on things and you don't even know what strain of bacteria you're getting. So it can vary by brand, and as is the American health system, or I should say the governmental, Food and Drug Administration, there's really no way of regulating any of this stuff, unfortunately. So it's very hit or miss. I would say, unless you go to extreme measures that are probably not covered by insurance and you're getting like a bacterial test done, even then it can change because it changes with external factors, life cycle changes. Like we're always constantly, the ratio and the population is doing different things. So that's why we usually recommend go with the food version if you can. Like every day have a little something, right? Either give yourself a fork full of sauerkraut, or if you like kombucha, cool. I would try to say, lay off of too much of all of this all at one time. We don't necessarily think, because good is a little is good, that a lot is better. Not necessarily the case. Like I mentioned before, with the food with the fiber in it, too much of that can be like, oh my gosh, my stomach feels like it's bloated out to here and I feel very uncomfortable now. So same thing with probiotic food, that there's a fermentation happening in there. So here's where, if you have IBS, that you might be exacerbating the condition because that fermentation is happening in your gut. So if you are eating, sauerkraut in the morning, and then you're having tempeh, which is a fermented soy product, later that afternoon, and then you're having a drink called kombucha later on, like that could be a lot for your body to handle if you're dealing with already existing gut conditions. All right, let's talk about foods, particularly if I say, name a food that you think doesn't do your gut any service. What comes to mind? Obviously, you see what I have listed here, but what comes to mind? What are some foods or beverages that are not necessarily great on your gut? You can throw that in the chat if you want to. And as you're thinking about that, I will advance. And forgive me, because like I said, I'm keeping my eye on the time because I have to wrap up in about 10 to 15 minutes. Um, yeah, there we go, Brittany. Thank you. Any kind of spicy foods, right? So we have highly processed food or ultra processed foods. I'll explain that in a second. Refined sugars like candy and chips and all the fun things that we like, right? Those sweets and treats. Refined grains. So again, globally speaking, white rice is a common staple, but it's about, we'll talk in a sec too, as I'm going through this list, what's considered a high intake of, or what is considered a moderate intake of something. So highly processed foods, things that are not very recognizable, gone through a lot of manufacturing. My example to this is usually, a very minimally processed food or unprocessed food would be corn, right? Corn on the cob. I cut them off. I cut corn kernels off. I stick it into a can. I put the, salt process in there, and I now have canned corn. That's a minimally or moderately processed food. I smash down all that corn and I turn it into Frito chips or tortilla chips or something. That becomes a much more highly processed food because now the nutrient value might be taken out of it and it's become further away from its natural version way back there. Yeah, okay, so spicy foods as well, right? This could be an issue too, as far as gut busting. And I will say this is where it becomes a discussion around moderation and also access. Okay, so I don't want to make anybody feel bad about the food choices that they make. If you do not have access to certain foods, you might only be able to get your hands on some things that are highly processed, like bagged things or canned things or whatever processed foods there are, right? You might be able to just eat things that are on the lower end of or budget friendly, but not as nutrient dense. So we always want to meet you where you're at, but we also want to educate you and give you other resources that can help you figure out how do we spread that out? Like, are there other things that you can bring into your diet that might be missing to help alleviate that, right? I have a huge sweet tooth. Every night I will have something sweet. Absolutely. Sometimes I have a lot of sweet things, but I really try to not do that throughout the whole entire day. I try not to have cookies in the morning and then mid-afternoon I'm chasing it down with like a milkshake or something. I try to space things out so that 80-ish% of my meals are a little bit more nutrient dense and wholer, I guess, if that's a term, because I do suffer from some gastro issues. And then, you know, 10 to 20% of my day, my week, my meals, whatever, are all the fun things or the things that might be a little bit more gut busting. Same thing with alcohol, right? That's technically a beverage, not the greatest thing for you. Don't even get me started. I always go on a tangent when I talk about alcohol consumption. The one thing I didn't mention earlier, but I have mentioned in many of the webinars before, is that our gut, the cells that make up our gastrointestinal system, are epithelial cells, and they are very high in turnover rates. So what happens is if you damage them, it's very quick that all the other cells will be damaged as well. So one of the main cancers is esophageal cancer that we see sometimes, or down below too, if we have stomach cancer or intestinal cancer, like it's very quick that happens. Same thing with celiac disease, right? The smashing of the microvilli. It's again the high turnover. So you're damaging the cells by either you're not treating them well, or there's a condition that you're dealing with that's not being managed properly, and the complications can ensue. So we try to be very, very conscientious as to what we're doing to our gut. But we also try to make sure we're not judging anybody for the choices that they're making. We're just educating and hoping we can also provide some guidance as to what to do next. All right, let's talk about non-food gut busting. I mentioned two of those factors earlier on. Anybody want to throw in the chat what you think might be a gut buster non-food related? And as you're coming up with some ideas there, I'll go through what we have here. Stress. Huge. Quite honestly, as a dietitian, it cracks me up that I would rather talk to people about stress management / self-care and sleep than I would nutrition. When I'm talking to them about what they can do to help them manage their chronic conditions, I almost always talk to them about self-care and sleep. Did I mention sleep in here? Nope, let me go back one. Okay. So sleep is an issue too. So stress, we said the bidirectionality, that communication. There we go, Brittany, exactly, right? So sometimes a lot of antibiotics or other medications can absolutely interfere as well. Smoking, again, right? It's going down your areas that's going to cause cancer. Don't do it. Physical inactivity. We want the body to move and help force things in directions that they need to go. That really does make a difference if our blood is circulating and oxygen is flowing. So the more you can move, whatever you can move, the better. Cross-contamination. I think a couple of, oh gosh, was it last, I forget what webinar we talked about, like food safety, right? The National Nutrition Month in March. We talked about food safety, cross-contamination, foodborne illnesses. So again, especially if you are in an immunocompromised population, like somebody recovering from cancer or being treated for cancer, HIV, the older group of people, seniors, etc., you would be more at risk for things like that. Environmental factors, right? You don't know what kind of heavy metals might be exposed. You might be exposed to pollution, etc. And interestingly enough, that last bullet, which says hygiene, might not be what you're thinking. We're talking about people keeping too clean. So what happens there, what we found in research is the more and the earlier we are exposed to certain allergens, pollutants, let your kids play in the dirt type of thing, the less at risk we are for contracting certain allergies or chronic conditions down the line. So being too hygienic, and I know, believe me, I know we're still in the pandemic. We're told wash your hands all the time. And yes, we definitely want to stay clean, but sometimes too clean is not great. We don't want to be in a sanitary environment. Of course, I'm going to just caveat this. There could be issues where people do need to have what's known as a very, sanitary or hygienic area because of whatever they're going through, but that's a very small group of population. We're trying to say, let your kids play in the dirt, go expose yourselves. Don't lick a Subway, but maybe lick a Subway once in a while. I don't know. So just, these are things that could possibly slow down your immunity. And so what we want to do is we want your immunity to build up. This is why we inject you with vaccines. We try to get that virus and your body to understand, like, oh, this is what it's doing. And so, I'm doing that. That didn't really make much sense in the hygiene discussion, but I think you know where I'm going. So now that you've learned a little bit of a lot of things related to your gut, I want to ask you, what do you think your next steps could be? On the right-hand side, I have what we sometimes will recommend as an ideal healthy plate. And obviously, as you can see here, yes, there's meat on the top, there's potatoes on the bottom. Nothing wrong with these things, but we're talking about moderation and portion. We want to make sure that we're encouraging your gut bacteria to grow and help you with your functions and build your immunity. So ideally, if you're eating a meal, however you sit down and eat it, whether it looks like this dish or it's a smoothie of some sort, you're kind of ratioing things out. Protein, starchies, or grains, and then left-hand side, the non-starchy veggies. So things like broccoli and lettuce and your fruits and tomatoes and those sort of things. You also see on the left-hand side too, right? I integrated the discussion around increased physical activity, or at least maintaining some sort of consistent physical activity, honoring self-care. Self-care can definitely include sleep discussions as well. I know a lot of students who follow me, or really anybody, listen, sleep habits are an issue no matter what. It's not like just because you're cramming for a test or working on a project that your sleep is suffering. Your sleep can be suffering for a variety of reasons. And then smoking or alcohol cessation. So if you are currently feeling like you could just do a little bit better, right? Make it a 10 to 20% improvement in something, whether it's your diet or other sort of lifestyle habits. Maybe make a commitment to yourself right now that in the next coming weeks, you'll start being a little bit more mindful and maybe set some boundaries with yourself or with others, or maybe make some better choices for yourself when it comes to food and nutrition. Or if you're not sure what your gut is doing, go see a doctor. And when you see that doctor, you immediately ask them to go see a dietitian. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to open it up for, I think I've got 5 minutes left before I have to officially get out of here. So let's take a look at anybody in the chat that chimed in with any other questions. If not, you can feel free to throw them in right now. our next webinar, so you're on here now, you'll get the newsletter, you'll see me on social media dumping a lot of information in the coming weeks. Our next webinar will take place a little bit over a month from now. We're going to focus on food allergies and intolerances. So you'll start noticing things tie into other things. What I might be talking about in the food allergy discussion, I definitely covered some of that in the sustainability discussion last month with National Nutrition Month, and some of it also came up in today's conversation. So it helps to kind of see how there's like an interplay of things. So that will take place on Thursday, May 16. I forgot to put down Eastern time, 12 p.m. Eastern time on that. So as always, I very much appreciate everyone who joins in. If you were unable to attend this live, obviously the recording will go out. And Brittany, again, the questions that you're posing in here, I would say yes, but, right? So there's always a yes, but, or an it depends. I know it sounds ridiculous as a dietitian because it really does. Like every person is different. So they can eat red meat, but it depends on do they suffer from something when they do eat red meat? And when they eat red meat, is it in the shape of like, a well-done hamburger with a side of French fries and a milkshake? So is it a combination of all that stuff? Like red meat on its own is probably not going to be an issue, but again, portion and moderation is an issue here too, because we don't we've seen excessive consumption of certain meat products could potentially put people at risk for other things like cancer and specifically what is it? Colon cancer, I think. So we want to colorectal cancer. So we want to make sure you're not eating, an entire cow every single day of the week all the time, but maybe 2 days a week or 2 nights a week you have red meat, and maybe one day you do it in like a seared flank steak and another day you do it as a hamburger. So, and think about what you're eating with it too. Like you just saw in that picture, right? This thing here, top right? That's meat. Totally fine. Again, if you are abiding by that like FODMAP approach, the meat, right? So it's not a fermentable sugar. There's no fermentable sugars inside of meat. It's a pure protein. There might be some fat in it too. So probably less likely to be an issue for IBS, but it does take a very long time for meat and proteins in general to digest. So it could be like, oh, I feel kind of sluggish, or when I eat this, I feel like my gut's kind of churning. How you're chewing it, how you're swallowing it, how you're cooking it definitely plays a role in there. So I hope that kind of answers the question, even though it's always like, it depends. Maybe I really need to see what other things people are eating, and are they smoking while they're eating a burger? Like that could be an issue too for anybody with IBS or gut conditions in general. Thanks everybody so much for being here, for your questions. Thank you, Brittany, and thank you everyone else. Appreciate it. You're very welcome. I hope to see you again in our next discussion. As you know, I'll be following up with the recording link to this, the survey link to this, and you always have all my contact information if you ever want to reach out and work with me in a different way. Bye, everybody. Thanks so much.